Okay, so welcome, fellow history nerds, to another Local History Presents. My name, as you probably already know, is Shannon Butler, and I'm the historian here for the Poughkeepsie Public Library District. If you've attended my lectures before, you know I tend to be a little silly in my way of doing things and my way of explaining things. That's still will be the case tonight. But schools and seminaries of old Poughkeepsie, there's a lot of interesting things to talk about as far as some of the old educational institutions that were here in Poughkeepsie at one point, and some of them still exist. And there's some schools that I'm going to leave out entirely, and I'll explain why at the end. Because I know some people will go, well, she forgot this one and she forgot that one. Look, no. I didn't necessarily forget anything. I actually had to set boundaries for myself, because those of you who know me know that I can talk a lot. When it comes to anything historical, any local history subject matter, I can just about talk forever. So I had to set sort of guidelines and boundaries for myself as to what schools I was going to discuss. So we're gonna just jump into this thing. If my computer will catch up with me. There we go. Okay. So these are just a few of the schools that we're going to be talking about tonight. And one of the things you'll notice about every single one of the buildings in these images are now long gone. All of these schools no longer exist. And that will be the case for a lot of the schools we're going to talk about tonight. So when it comes to education in this area, in Poughkeepsie, that is, there seemed to be no shortage of schools that one could attend in the 19th century here in Poughkeepsie. If we go back to the humble beginnings of the settlement of this area, there wasn't a whole lot of schools to choose from. As a matter of fact, the first local academy was all the way down in Fishkill, and that didn't appear until 1750. Before that, for the most part, the education that you would receive was through your church. That's where real early education begins. And that's perfect, because Poughkeepsie was sort of founded around the creation of the Dutch Reformed Church. That was actually created in 1720, right here in Poughkeepsie. So that's where you get your first education. Now, was your education mostly religious and biblically related? Sure it was, but that's better than nothing. So it comes as no surprise that the first actual academy to be opened in the area was run by a Reverend Chauncey Graham. And that was down, like I said, down in Poughkeepsie. Down in Fishkill. And a lot of Poughkeepsie students would make their way down to Fishkill to be educated by this good Reverend. So after the American Revolution, there is a push to open up more schools in the area. And that's thanks in part to an act. This is a very, very appropriate title. It's the Act for the Encouragement of Schools. And that was right around 1795. And the big pusher behind this act was then Governor of New York State, Governor George Clinton. And George Clinton, of course, big local name in the area. He's buried up at the old Dutch church in Kingston, right? He was a general during the American Revolution. He was then governor of New York State, our very first official governor, and then eventually served as vice president of the United States. He was actually the first vice president to die in office. And now I'm forgetting the year exactly. I used to know George Clinton inside and out. 1812, I believe. But anyway, George Clinton was a big advocate for education. And so he was the one very, very much responsible behind the Act for the Encouragement of Schools. Oh, and by the way, misconception, got to get it out of the way. The Clinton House on Main Street in Poughkeepsie, where the Dutchess County Historical Society is located, actually has nothing to do with George Clinton. That was discovered pretty early on, actually, in the early 20th century by who I like to refer to as the patron saint of local history, Helen Wilkinson Reynolds. She pointed that out in her research, saying, "Yeah, guys, George Clinton never stayed there. Sorry, guys." So that's I've always found that story pretty interesting. Anyway, see what I'm doing here? I go down those rabbit holes, and it's nonstop. Anyway, so 1792 is actually when we really get our first Poughkeepsie Academy, and they would call it the Dutchess Academy, as you see here from this lovely little sketch on the screen. So that's the first academy, and actually it moved from Fishkill to Poughkeepsie. That's what happened in 1792. And originally it was located on the corner of Academy and Cannon Street. That's, of course, where the name Academy Street comes from. Now you know Academy Street has this beautiful street full of these fabulous mansions and great big houses, but it was named because that was the original location of Dutchess Academy. In 1836, a larger building was built. As a matter of fact, this building right here. And of course, that is on the corner of South Hamilton and Montgomery Street. And so that's the building that everybody really associates with as the Dutchess Academy. But there was an earlier building on the corner of Cannon and Academy earlier. So this, of course, would become the Old Ladies' Home by 1870. And now, today, you know it as the Vassar Warner Home. And of course, the building is still standing. But that was the first major academy here in Poughkeepsie way back in 1792. However, there is another small school that I believe predates it, 1791, and it was on Church Street, and it was called the Lancaster School. And it was in a building that I think is now essentially a dance club, actually, on Church Street. But there was another institution, and I may have this wrong, but I believe it was partially run by Quakers. So anyway, but this is the one that people really recognize as our first real academy in the area. Now, this map right here is from about 1831, and right around 1850 or so is when Poughkeepsie earns its infamous nickname, the City of Schools. So that's pretty early on, actually. We became a city, officially chartered a city in 1854. So right about that same time, you get this nickname that pops up. And there's a good reason for that. There were so many private schools that you could attend. And actually, in 1854, you even had a couple of free public schools opening up at this time. We'll get more into that later. But for example, you had Christ Church had a school where the Armory now stands today. That was from about 1845 to 1858. You had, they moved that school, Christ Church moved to Market and Pine Streets by 1884. There was a small school established, I should say, there was a small school that was established on Montgomery Street near Hamilton. It was called the School for Practical Agriculture and Horticulture. You also had a small school dedicated to Cuban boys in the area. That was a brief thing. You had Lydia Booth's Female Seminary, which began right around 1835. The lists go on forever and ever and ever. We're going to talk a lot about them. But the best way to find the schools, who was listed when and where, is to look through the old Poughkeepsie Journal. Now, you can flip through the pages of the Poughkeepsie Journal or the Daily Eagle and find mentions of just about any kind of school that you can imagine at the time. And I found this really great quote, actually, in the Poughkeepsie Journal in 1850. And I want to read you this quote because it really is fabulous. Those of you who read the Poughkeepsie Journal know that it's generally always been a very opinionated newspaper, and it was much more so in the 19th century. They always had something to say about everything that was going on. But I do like this quote. "We think it's safe to say that no place in the United States, other things being equaled, contains an amount of education, ability, or first-class institutions of learning superior to those located in our own beautiful village. No place has won so high and just a reputation in this particular, and no place can be selected by parents who design their children, either male or female, should have a superior and finished education, where such object can be more successfully and satisfactorily attained. So, yeah, pretty full of the whole educational vibe the Poughkeepsie Journal was. So we're going to talk about some of these famous schools, and I thought we'd start with one of the earliest, the Poughkeepsie Collegiate Institute. In 1835, a group of men strolled up the hillside that overlooked the city of Poughkeepsie. During their walk, it was recommended by one of these gentlemen, a guy named Mr. Charles Bartlett. He was a teacher. He had operated in schools most of his life. And he said, guys, this would be a perfect place for a school, right here on this hill. Now, this group of men included some bigwigs in the area, including N.P. Talmadge, John Delafield, and Jacob Van Benthosen. They, right there on that very spot, decided, we'll purchase this hillside as long as you agree to be the principal of the school. And that's exactly what they did. So in 1835, they bought the grounds, $12,000 for this land, and then they went ahead and they started building. They decided to model their school after the Parthenon in Athens, only much smaller, 35 feet by 115 feet, and the colonnade around it was 77 feet by 137 feet. And it cost well over $40,000 to construct this building. That is a lot of money in 1835. So this would become the Poughkeepsie Collegiate Institute. The interior of the school had a full lower level, as you see here, right just below the stairs there. And in that lower level were two large halls for recreation, and they were surrounded by smaller rooms containing spaces for bathrooms and wardrobes. There was also a dining area and a kitchen on the first lower level. The main floor contained a large classroom plus a library and an apartment for a live-in family to oversee the facility. The second floor had dormitories for students. And there was a private space with a cot for each student and rooms at the end of the hall for teachers and supervisory attendants. The attic had more living space for students and caretakers. If you notice in this photograph, though, the only windows that are open are up in that attic. So those are in the days before central air, right? On a day like today, I would not want to be all the way up there. No way. I feel bad for any students up there. Maybe they were the failing students. They get the attic space, freshmen or something like that. So the school was overseen by Mr. Bartlett when it first opened in 1836, all the way up to his death in 1857. So he was pretty much the head honcho there until he died. Now, during those years, each term would see somewhere about 80 students in attendance. And that's pretty much full. They are booked. There's no more room for anybody else. 80 students was pretty much the max. Some of the big local names attended the school, like the Adrian's family, Platts, Bartlett's, and Van Cleets, just to name a few. In a little handwritten book that we have in our collection from 1850, it was actually intended to be sort of like a newsletter. It was called the Mercury. Students wrote of their school. I got a little piece here. They said that their school has obtained a widespread and well-deserved reputation, not only for the superior advantage which it affords, but also for the high degree of attainment to which its pupils are brought. The school would attract writers and lecturers from all over the country to come and teach and lecture for the students. And it was really just a very well-received institution. If you read through the Poughkeepsie Journal, they sometimes wrote reviews. Travelers would write reviews about the school, and they were all very positive. There was never anything negative about the school ever written that I came across anyway. So after Bartlett died in 1857, two other teachers took up the reins. Otis Bisbee, who's actually on the right-hand side here, the guy with the big mutton chops and the rosy cheeks, and Charles B. Waring, the guy with the big beard on the left. After the Civil War, the two of these guys apparently split ways. They ended their partnership, and Warren, he decided to open up his own school, sort of a military-style school, and that would later become known as the Poughkeepsie Military Institute. It's actually where Charles B. Waring's school is today. Now, Otis Bisbee, he actually was leaving the Poughkeepsie Collegiate Institute as well. Not so much that he wanted to, but the school ended up having to be sold to actually settle the estate of Charles Bartlett, who had died about 10 years before. This is about 1867. So he actually tried to win the school buildings at auction, but he was outbid by a guy named George Morgan. And George Morgan comes in and he takes over the place. So Bisbee moved his efforts to educate kids down to another school, the Riverview Academy, which we're going to talk about in just a second. Anyway, George Morgan tried to build that school into a resort, into a hotel. And of course, he builds Morgan Lake, right? That was there on the property. It's still there today. But the hotel never really does that well. And the building just kind of sits dormant for quite some time. Until about 1892, thanks to one of the directors.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for allowing us to do this. Appreciate it. Don't come over here and watch us forever go, man. This thing's on. Look at the face on this thing. What's you want, bro? I'm saying just go with this color. Wow, really?
Who's making all the noise?
Out there on camera. Oh my God.
I don't know. Trina, are you the one who's making all that noise? Okay, anyway, where was I? It's one of the things I don't like about Zoom. Okay, so 1892, William Smith of the Smith Brothers Cough Drops Factory, he buys the old property there and turns it into a park, actually. He actually purchased the land there for $11,600, which is interesting because in 1835, they bought that land for $12,000. And then all the way in 1892, now suddenly it's dropped $400. When does that ever happen in real estate? I don't know. Anyway, so it becomes a park. Oh, we'll see those guys later. And it looked like this. It was a very popular place to hang out. The gardens were fabulous. The building that once housed over 80 young minds and teachers was now home to a few city employees who took care of the grounds and the flower gardens. We can see here that the images are definitely postcard worthy. However, sadly, on February 11th, 1917, the building itself caught fire and was completely destroyed, while hundreds of people from the city watched as this building just went up in flames. A lot of them had attended the school, so it was quite devastating to witness this fire. Here's the sad remains of the Poughkeepsie Collegiate Institute. You know, it's quite a sad loss for the area, simply for the architectural appeal. It was quite a lovely building. So it wasn't until the 1930s, during the years of the Works Progress Administration, that the Parthenon colonnade was recreated by funds left by a guy named Guilford Dudley. He was a wealthy banker, he was a hardware store owner, and a native of Poughkeepsie. He had actually studied at the Duchess Academy, that old school that we mentioned earlier. So today, when you walk up that hillside, you will see this recreation of what once stood. And of course, you can go golfing too while you're there. Okay. So I thought I would tackle some of the early girls' schools for a little bit, because long before the opening of Vassar College, there existed the desire to educate young women here in Poughkeepsie. As a matter of fact, several schools popped up all over Poughkeepsie, the city of Poughkeepsie, in the mid-19th century, and they strongly encouraged proper education for girls. These included schools like the Poughkeepsie Female Academy, which was located on Cannon Street, seen here in this photograph. It would later become the Women's Christian Temperance Union building. Sadly, the building is now gone. It's not on Cannon Street anymore. The Mansion Square boarding school for girls, which of course obviously would be located near Mansion Square. And this one does not appear to have lasted very long. I have not found much information on this one. We only have this little catalog from 1844 here in our collections. There was also the Cottage Hill Seminary. Now this school was started by the niece of Matthew Vassar. Her name was Lydia Booth, and it was started around 1835. And it said that she's really one of the inspirations in Matthew Vassar's desire to create a school for girls, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Now, this was located on Garden Street between Mansion and Mill. But for the most part, these schools were short-lived, a lot of them, with the exception of this school right here. It actually had several names during the course of its existence: the Female Collegiate Institute, Cook's Collegiate, aka Linden Hall. It's got a long list of names, but it's one of the longest running female seminaries around Poughkeepsie, even though the name changed a few times. But it still pretty much remained the same thing. So we're going to take a look at this particular school. Now, the year is 1848. And small schools have been popping up all over Poughkeepsie, as we've mentioned. Dr. Charles H.P. McClellan was in the midst of creating a school dedicated to giving young ladies the knowledge to establish themselves as housewives and teachers, which is pretty much your only choices if you're a chick in the 19th century. That's it. Get married or teach. So, needless to say, the education can sometimes be kind of limited. But McClellan wanted to create a school that was small and selective. It would have enough room for students to board, to stay there, but it could also have plenty of room for students who were living nearby to just commute and walk to classes. The school was located on the corner of Catherine and Mill Streets, and it began as a small brick building, which opened in 1849. The first graduating class was quite small indeed. 4 girls, to be exact, 2 from Poughkeepsie, 1 from Fishkill, and 1 from Staten Island. Now, in the 1860s, the cost for a year at the school was about $200, which included a furnished room. Or you could choose to limit what classes you want to take. Like, for example, this receipt here, which we have in our collection. This is Miss C. Sherman, and she chose to focus her studies on music and ancient languages. And for this, she paid $30.80 in 1861. That's about $1,000 today. So that sounds about right. In 1862, the school was sold to Reverend C.D. Rice, who continued to operate it as the Poughkeepsie Female Collegiate. until the 1870s, when Professor George Cook bought the school and named the school Cook's Collegiate Institute. During his tenure, Cook included a course that prepared girls for a freshman year at Vassar College, which at that point was fairly new. Here we have a great image. This is from Mill Street. Now, if you're standing on this spot on Mill Street today, you will see modern apartments being built in this location, where this school once was. Now, Young Ladies published a monthly editorial known as the Tyro, which we have several copies of here in our collection. And they wrote about a little bit of everything: travel, science, poetry. In 1875, they began to produce an alumni quarterly as well, which showcased the writing talents of some of these girls. There's one in particular that stuck out with me. There's a piece by a girl named A. Harwood. And in it, she mentions the need for women to have access to higher education. She questioned why women were still not being given the chance to improve, quote, as God intended them. And she proclaimed that there was more to being a woman than commonly believed. You go, Miss Harwood. The school, like I said, changed names, and again in 1884, when Professor Samuel Wells Buck and his wife purchased the school. He had previously served as the principal of Poughkeepsie High School. So his wife served as a teacher, he served as the principal, and the Bucks renamed the school the Linden Hall School. And they kept it going for another 25 years ago, until about 1909. The alumni of the school were still making news by the 20th century. In fact, a couple of women who had graduated from the school ended up serving as teachers in World War I. They went over to Europe to teach, which was pretty cool. So they got their names in the papers, which is quite something for a woman back in the day. By 1921, the building had been converted into apartments, and until recent decades, it was just a parking lot. But like I said, now they're building apartments there. So there's a future to be held on that site. Now, also, I just want to mention, if you haven't been to the library recently, on our reference floor, we have glass exhibit cases. And on display right now, we have a lovely collection of quilting samples that were done by the girls of the school in the 1880s, 1890s, I believe a lot of them are dated. And it's just a fabulous collection of these crazy quilting samples, beautiful, bright colors, really, really great embroidery. The collection actually was given to us by Vassar College because someone gave it to Vassar College, assuming that it was Vassar girls who did it, but it wasn't. It was the Linden Hall School girls who did it. So Vassar gave it to us recently. And when we got the box, my colleague and I, we looked at it and we're like, oh, we got to put these on display. They're so beautiful. So if you get a chance in the next few weeks or so, before I go ahead and switch up exhibits again, do come and take a look at those quilting samples. They're quite attractive and well over 120 years old, some of them. Okay, so that's the Linden Hall School. Our next school was yet another girls' school. Like I said, there was quite a few. And this one was formed by a Dr. Frederick Martin Townsend. Townsend had served as a principal for a school in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and he wanted to continue his work as a teacher under the inspiration and sort of the guidance of the Episcopal Church. So he came up here and purchased a small girls' school that was kind of already established, but not a whole lot of students. And that was the Miss Eleanor Shackelford's St. Faith School. Miss Shackelford had actually taken this gorgeous mansion that you see here in this photograph. This was the mansion of John F. Hume. And it was located on Washington Street. And she had taken it and made it into a little school. And so Townsend came along and purchased it in 1910 and turned it into the Glen Eden Seminary, as he called it. So it was to serve as part finishing school, part college prep. That was the plan. The school offered classes in major languages of the world, as well as mathematics, music, art, history, science. There was an added fee for a class called domestic sciences, which was essentially how to cook, clean, and take care of a home, which was still the most likely option for girls at this time. And the final exam, the final exam for this class was you had to prepare a complete luncheon for special guests because, ladies, nobody's going to marry you if you can't put on a proper luncheon. Am I right? Well, sorry. So anyway, this was the final exam. So this is the back end of the school here. Here we have some girls leaving the front porch of the lovely Glen Eden. The fee for attendance was $600 per year. It was the first year of operations. It received more applicants that they had room for, so it was a very popular place to go. It was well advertised, as we're going to see in a little bit. The school filled with there was 50 students in residence, which was quite a big deal. Here we have one of the cozy rooms here. This was shared by, it looks like, two girls were living in this cozy little space. So it was a nice place to be. They had fine dorm rooms, as you can see. The school considered themselves, quote, a church school, meaning that they operated under certain Christian values, and students were expected to attend Sunday services at the local Episcopal churches. Now, the girls were also expected to be active and maintain good physical health. The campus had tennis courts, as you see here. It had a basketball court as well on the grounds. There were several hiking and horseback riding opportunities. They also encouraged the girls to learn fencing, as we see here, very cool. They had trips where they would head into the city of Poughkeepsie to go to the YWCA for roller skating and bowling. The girls also took several excursions into neighboring sightseeing spots. They loved to go to Lake Mohawk. That was a big place to go to. And they would take the steamer ships up the Hudson to Kingston and enjoy the parks up there. Of course, the brochures for the college informed interested parents that, quote, a chaperone accompanies all excursion parties. Of course. This is one of the ads that you would typically see. This was in Scribner's magazine in 1912. And you can see right next door, the Bennett School for Girls, which of course is in Millbrook, another big school in the area. Now, sadly, as Poughkeepsie morphed into a more active city with a crowded and noisy waterfront, the school's main appeal as a pleasant school in the beautiful, quiet countryside, hence the Eden in the name, right? Glen Eden. Right. So apparently Poughkeepsie was slowly falling from Eden as far as Dr. Townsend was concerned. He saw a need to move the school entirely. He stated that it was because of the new mills built on Delafield Street that created too much noise and pollution. I get it. So he actually moved the school by 1919. And then after that, the Glen Eden house, that property, would become a hotel for a bit, on and off in the 30s and so forth. And there was talk of it even becoming apartments at one point, but you would be more familiar with the property as the site of Mike Ortega's gym and the Dutchess County Stabilization Center. So that's where that would have been located. I like Karen's thought here. All men purchasing schools to train women how to be housewives. Yep, there's truth to that, Karen. Absolutely. All right. So let's move on a little bit to another school. Let's see. This is the Brooks Seminary for Girls, later known as Putnam Hall. which began right about the same time that Vassar College started, somewhere around 1871. It was located where Bartlett Park is today. Exactly right where there's a parking lot now at Bartlett Park. That's where it was. The school was originally started by, actually, this time around, a woman, Mary Johnson. Then she married a guy named Edward White, and the two would expand the school to this right here. They added this whole other wing in the back, as you can see. And this was quite the property. The building was on the corner of Hamscott and what's now Hooker Avenues. And one of the school's brochures proclaimed, quote, Brooks Seminary is located at Poughkeepsie, New York, just styled the city of schools. So they're using that nickname to sort of bring students in here in the 1870s. The brochure went on to proclaim that the grounds and the building were fit for any gentleman's mansion. When one entered the school, one did not find a principal's office. One found a fancy parlor, just like one would find inside a fancy mansion. And the art on the walls was excellent artwork, all done by the female professors of the college. So they definitely sold this as a fancy, elaborate, mansion-like school. The school claimed that they did not believe in traditional dormitories, actually. They instead valued privacy of their students. However, the rooms generally housed 3 to 4 girls. But I don't know how much privacy you got there, but yeah. And they went on to say, quote, you may make a grand tour of Europe and find in no hotel such comfortable accommodations. That's true. Hotels in Europe and that general area, their rooms are always very tiny. Anyway, there was one large lecture hall where the students would listen to professors, and they also had desks to work from. They also had smaller music rooms up on the second floors, and they had an art studio with a skylight for painting. Apparently art was a really big deal here. There was a large common dining room where the girls took their meals, and it was expected that they would attend church. They could either go to a local church in the area of their choosing, or they had a reverend on site for church in their school hall. The school seemed to do well, and attendance was high. The tuition was about $400 a year, and this was a full 4-year boarding school. They also prepped girls for future learning at Vassar College, which was just down the road. And at the end of the school year in 1880, Mr. and Mrs. White decided to move the school from Poughkeepsie to Brooklyn. So the building sat vacant for a while and was used partially as a hotel and partially as a dormitory for Vassar College. Let's see. So by 1901, the building was back in use as a school with teachers Ellen C. Bartlett and Frances Wilbeski. They were in charge. We have Miss Bartlett right here, as you see. And now Ellen, was no stranger to education. We've already mentioned the name Bartlett before, right? Her father, Charles Bartlett, who ran the Poughkeepsie Collegiate Institute way back in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, right? So she was brought up to be a teacher. Now, until 1920, she's pretty much running the show here. The school taught elementary children, and then they did high school work as well. So it's kind of like an all-purpose school, really. And they also offered college prep and sent a lot of students to Vassar. Bartlett ended up running the school for about 30 years. And she took great pride in being able to say that she had sent so many girls to Vassar College. It was a big deal for her. In 1921, the school purchased land to expand the campus from the neighboring DeGarmo estate. And they added another building to the property, which I'm going to mention in a second. And once again, they're inspiring the girls to get out and do horseback riding and basketball. Here's the basketball team of 1922. Love the hair, ladies. Very nice. This is a bungalow that was built on the property by a local architect named Edward C. Smith. And those of you who have maybe followed my weekly history blog here at the Poughkeepsie Public Library, I've mentioned Edward C. Smith a couple times because I've been kind of hunting down his buildings throughout Poughkeepsie. And he did a lot of really interesting houses. And I managed to come across one, and I just wanted to photograph the exterior of it. And the lady who owned it was out with her kids, and she's like, "Are you looking for something?" And I said, "Well, I'm looking for a house built by Edward C. Smith. I think it's this one right here." She's like, "Yes, it is. That's my house. Would you like to come inside?" I'm like, "Yes." So just kind of managed to sneak inside a lovely Edward C. Smith home. But I think that the bungalow that he designed for this school is actually still standing, unlike the school itself. I believe that it is number 17 Circular Drive. That's just my historian gut feeling based on maps and so forth. I could be wrong, but that's one thing. So if anybody lives on Circular Drive in Poughkeepsie and you know the owner of number 17, could you just pop on their house, say, "Hey, is this an Edward C. Smith building?" I think it is. You know, they'll probably be, "What?" Or they'll be like the lovely lady who I met before. I'm like, "Well, yes, it is." Anyway, so 1923, and actually the 1930s to be specific, the cost for tuition, if you were a town student, that is, you're just kind of walking to school, you're not boarding, was only $200. If you were boarding, it was $1,500. This is in the 1930s. So they really relied heavily on their boarding students for the money. However, by 1934, there were only 4 boarding students in this school. So they closed down by the summer of 1940. Eventually, Miss Bartlett donated that land to become a park. So it became a city park after the school had ended in 1940. So that is Putnam Hall. Moving on, we're going backwards a little bit. We're going to go back to some of the boys' schools. Now, when we left off at College Hill, you had the 2 main teachers there parting ways, right? You had Charles Warren starting his little Poughkeepsie Military Institute, as he called it. Now, for Otis Bisbee, the guy with the mutton chops and the bright red cheeks, he had managed to win. He couldn't win the College Hill property, but he managed to create for himself his own school by buying land just west of Eastman Park. And on a spring day in 1867, the entire school marched, very military-like, from the College Hill campus down to what would become known as Riverview to begin classes in their new location. This school included about 5 acres of sporting fields, a gymnasium, school buildings, living quarters. A grand total of $70,000 was spent by Mr. Otis Bisbee to improve the campus, and was no doubt a nerve-wracking experience, pouring all this money into this institution. However, it paid off because within a year, they were overflowing with students from all over the nation. This school did very well. The main school building had classrooms on the first floor, and the next 2 floors were apartments for the students, who were actually referred to as cadets, very much like West Point. The building was designed by J.A. Wood, who was famous for his hotels and armories and almshouses. He also designed a lot of buildings here in the area. The school catalog of 1888, here's what they proclaim. The building has hot and cold water on every floor. It is heated with steam, lighted with gas. It is believed that the building is equaled by few in the state for elegance, spacious accommodation, and conveniences of schoolboy life. The school officials declared that their chief aim was for their cadets to, quote, develop a manly character and improvement in academic study. So this was their hope was to send these guys off to West Point or perhaps even the Naval Academy. Now these guys here were there was no special exam needed to get into the school. It was pretty easy to become a cadet. However, you were expected to bring, this is what the kids were expected to bring: sheets, nightshirts, aka pajamas, their own spoons and forks, ties, gloves, umbrellas, a Bible, and a book of common prayer if you were Episcopal. They offered courses in writing, commercial arithmetic, bookkeeping, history, chemistry. As a matter of fact, we have a picture of the laboratory for chemistry right here. And Latin, music, drawing, and of course, military practices. Former school pupils included Episcopal Bishop of New York, Right Reverend Henry C. Potter, Judge Henry Gildersleeve, and Professor John Henry Wright of Harvard. So they had some big wigs come through here. Also have a view of the gymnasium, where you can see they were teaching the boys how to become strong and manly, as they said in their brochure. Life was quite pleasant, though, overall for the young men. Here we see one of the dormitories, where it looks like they've got two tiny, those beds are so tiny. I could not possibly sleep in that thing. Look at that, so tiny. Ugh. You have these little cadets' rooms where they've decorated them. It looks like the boys here like birds and tennis from the looks of it. And is that a banjo in the chair? A banjo, yeah. Oh, and a couple of swords too. They might be, actually that's probably their decorative uniform swords for marching and so forth. But life here was apparently quite nice. We have this great photo album in our collection from one of the students, and he took a lot of pictures of student life at the academy. So we've got some kids hanging out in the cadets room here. We've got some boys on the swing in the front of the Riverview Academy. Looks like they're reading some poetry. And we've got kids literally hanging out of the windows of the main school building here. So they were apparently enjoyed their studies and enjoyed life at the school. And the school seemed to do well right up until about 1910, when there was apparently some financial issues. In 1913, it was stated in the Poughkeepsie Journal that $10,000 in salaries was owed to the teachers' staff alone. So by 1921, the school closed down for good. After that, the building was used by the Vassar Christian Association as a community center, which would eventually become known as the Lincoln Center. And some of you might be old enough to remember the Lincoln Center, and it was a cool place to hang out back in the day. Improvements were made to the site in the 1930s by the WPA, which we see here in this photograph. And however, the buildings were declared unfit during the urban renewal years and condemned. And of course, I think the Lincoln Center that everyone's quite familiar with, the stone building, caught on fire, if I'm not mistaken. So anyway, if you find yourself kicking a ball around the soccer fields near Eastman, or I should say Lincoln Park, as it's now known, you will be walking the grounds where these cadets once walked. So it's kind of a neat thing. All right, the biggie. This was a big school. The school that had so much hype around it, you would have thought that it would have lasted forever. But sadly, it did not. And of course, it was all because of this guy right here, Harvey G. Eastman. Or if you have attended my previous talks in the past, the guy with the fabulous hair. I'm sorry. All I can picture is him storming into the Vail Brothers photography studio, sitting his butt down, and one of the Vail brothers just kind of going, Mr. Eastman, can I just fix it? And and Eastman just going, no, take the damn picture already, I'm busy. That's what I see when I look at this guy. Like, I don't give a damn about my hair. This is Eastman. Now, of course, he had been an educator all his life. He was from Oneida County, and he had various schools here in New York State and out west before the Civil War. And then he came back and landed in Poughkeepsie somewhere around 1859. And the story goes, he started by renting a small room for 75 cents a week with one student. And a year later, he had more students than he knew what to do with. He was renting more spaces, and it became a big deal. The school was soon bursting with students, in fact. I love this cartoon here. The catalogs were getting bigger and more detailed. The students were pouring in. Harvey began buying up buildings around the city to accommodate his school. The rules, as Eastman put it, if you read through the Eastman catalog, the rules said, don't drink, don't chew, meaning tobacco, don't smoke, don't swear, don't deceive, and don't read novels. That last one's amusing. In this cartoon here, we see a young man, and he's holding a bag that reads, "Start in life." And he's choosing which road to take. If he goes down the left road, this is for misdirected young men. It leads to schools that teach idleness and conceit. And at the end of the road is the asylum. That sounds terrible. But if he takes the road to the right, he will find self-reliance, manliness, and the very distinctive architecture of the Eastman Business College there. Industry, money, success, fame, friends. And eventually, this leads down the road to a savings bank. Very appealing cartoon, if you ask me. I guess I'd rather be at a savings bank than at a asylum. Now, there were classes and things like writing skills, banking, bookkeeping, and insurance, just to name a few. They even had a baseball team and a brass band. Eastman was, of course, as we've mentioned before, he was energetic, he was magnetic, he was a force to be reckoned with. And his advertising for this school, I mean, he just blew it up. You could find Eastman Business College advertisements everywhere, even overseas. It was a big, big thing. There were students that came from as far away as Japan to this school. With his advertisements and his class catalogs, he always made sure to include words of praise from local successful men in the area. For example, we have words from the historian, Mr. Benson Lossing, and he wrote, "With all good citizens, I wish to take this occasion to thank Mayor Eastman most sincerely for his useful labors, not only as a business educator, but for his unbounded zeal for the prosperity of Poughkeepsie." And yes, Eastman, of course, would serve as our mayor for quite a while. And then former governor of New York, Reuben Fenton, said, "Professor Eastman's system of business education has attained a high degree of usefulness, success, and celebrity in this country." Now, Eastman also made sure to include stories of the most wealthy men in his school catalogs, even though these men never attended the school, to remind the students of the benefits of being a good businessman. This page here shows you 3 of the most wealthy men in New York at the time. Alexander T. Stewart, who owned the largest dry goods store in New York City. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who made a ton of money in the steamboats business and then later on in trains. And William B. Astor, who inherited his father's fur company and then went on to make a killing in New York real estate. So none of these guys actually went to the Eastman College, but it's just kind of like a, hey, look what you can do if you have the smarts. Now, by the 1860s, Eastman was a wealthy man. As you know, he purchased his house, which was in Eastman Park, 27 acres of land, on the corner of Market and Montgomery Streets. And he spent an additional $200,000 to improve the land and the house. He also built 10 large townhouses, which of course today is known as Eastman Terrace. And he actually planned to build 24, but he kind of ran out of money. And there wasn't a huge interest in these terraces, unfortunately. He gave the city the famous Soldiers Fountain, which is located right down the street here at the entrance of his property. And like I said, he was mayor of Poughkeepsie by 1871 and I think until 1874, if I'm not mistaken. He was also the brains behind the Poughkeepsie Railroad Bridge, which is now the Poughkeepsie Walkway over the Hudson. But as we've talked about Eastman before, he died as a fairly young man. He was only 45 years old when he passed away from TB, actually. His funeral, I should say, on his grave, it says, "I have so tried to live as to do no man an injustice." So, after Eastman died, his brother-in-law, Mr. Ezra White, takes over the school. And he would serve for a while until Professor Clement Gaines takes over in the 1880s. Gaines also married Eastman's widow, Mary Minerva. And the school would continue to grow under Gaines. They would actually expand a bit. In 1883, the school on the corner of Mill and Washington Streets was created. That's the one you see here. They constructed that in 1883. And during its height, the school had nearly 2,000 students between the Poughkeepsie campus and a new one that they had built in New York City. Now, right about this time, something else begins to appear in the Eastman School catalogs that wasn't there before. Not to say that the sentiment could very well have been there. It's quite possible. But now it was bluntly and boldly printed on the first page of the catalog for all to see. Right down here at the bottom, it says, "These schools do not receive students of the Negro race." Now, this appears to have been a common feeling amongst a lot of the schools in Poughkeepsie. Granted, there wasn't a large African-American population, but still, it's right there in bold print on this catalog. There was even a scandal in 1905 when 160 students at Eastman College signed a petition to have one student expelled for being a Negro. This young man, Mr. C.V. Daniels, proclaimed that he was not, but he was rather a Puerto Rican. But President Gaines called the action narrow-minded, and he took Mr. Daniels down to the New York City campus, where he felt that he would better fit in. So the school was not perfect. Now, the school had its own bank. It had its own insurance company. It printed its own money for use within the school. By 1911, over 50,000 men and women, women were allowed to enroll by the early 20th century, had graduated. 50,000 people had graduated from this place. Sadly, by the time of the Great Depression, the school was suffering. The Poughkeepsie campus was pretty much all but abandoned by 1930. And then by 1933, the New York City campus closed down as well. So it was the end of an era. And the majority of the old private schools in Poughkeepsie by that time were kind of closing down anyway. Poughkeepsie the Poughkeepsie building for Eastman School was, we see it on the map here. It was demolished in 1932. This is our modern view. You see the Mid-Hudson Civic Center, the turn for 44, and then you've got Columbus Drive, and this area right here along Mill Street, that's where Eastman's College once sat. So all that's left behind are the scattered books and papers of former students within our collection here at the library. We have probably the largest collection of Eastman Business School materials. A lot of catalogs, a lot of practice books, a lot of photographs and things like that. So we have a lot of Eastman stuff. Okay, we don't have a whole lot of information on this next one. I stumbled onto this by accident. It's just kind of neat to know that there was once a school building where we library employees now park our cars. The building was built originally for Christ Church Parish, actually. It was a school somewhere around the mid-19th century. But then it became the Quincy School in 1880. Now, the school was run very similar to the local public schools in the sense that it was both for boys and girls. So it was, anyone could go, really. The idea was to teach a student based on their own needs and abilities and to develop lessons as opposed to just having students memorize text. The school was run by a woman named Mary Cornelia Agler for many years, and over time she expanded the school, spending pretty much most of her own money to make this thing a reality. I haven't been able to find a whole lot of information about the school, but I think Miss Agler stretched herself a bit thin on this project, and the school closed down by about 1907, 1908, give or take. Now, a bit earlier, we mentioned how Charles B. Waring had opened his own school, the Poughkeepsie Military Institute. He opened the school in 1863. And called it Dr. Waring's Boarding School at first. It eventually morphed into the Poughkeepsie Military Institute. The hope was that he could eventually send these boys off to West Point or the Naval Academy in Annapolis, just like the Riverview Academy was hoping. The school was located on the corner of Smith and Mansion Streets, where the current Warren Harding, where the current Waring School now stands. Students were referred to as cadets, once again, just like the other school, and even wore uniforms to match their ranks. As they earned their way, they made their way through schooling, they would rise up in the ranks and eventually become commissioned officers in full dress uniform, as we see here. Now, after a survey was conducted in 1841. It was determined that Poughkeepsie had 382 children between the ages of 5 and 16 who were not attending school. In 1843, an act was passed to create a school board, which would raise $7,000 by taxation for the establishment of free schools. Now, this act was not universally accepted by everybody. And there were some pretty negative opinions in the local newspapers. And it took some time before people would warm up to the idea of free public schools on their tax dollars. But anyway, up until this point, all of the academies that I've mentioned charged their students tuitions. So a lot of these schools were pretty much for well-off people to attend. So you had to have money to send your kids to Riverview Academy or Eastman or Glen, Eden, any of these schools. You had to have some money. So we finally start to see free public schools open up. This photograph here is actually a bit later. This is a group portrait of the number 8 school class located on Cannon Street, taught by May Thumby. This is around 1887 or so. In 1844, we find accounts of a church room being rented out as a Methodist church on Church Street. And it was supposedly used as a, quote, colored school with 35 students in attendance. I like this painting right here. This is by artist Edward Lamson Henry, and it is entitled Kept In, which is located at the Fenimore Art Museum up in Cooperstown. There was one other early school that allowed Black students, and that was the Lancaster School, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. But this particular, for many years, I should say, Black students were more or less educated at their church, to be specific, the AME Zion Church. It wasn't until 1873 when a well-known Black businessman named Joseph Rhodes came along and fought for his children to be allowed into public schools. His daughter Josephine went on to become the first Black graduate of Poughkeepsie High School in 1879. However, the principal of that school thought it best that Josephine not attend the ceremony, even though she was remarkably proficient in all of her studies. School number 2, which, like I said, was located on Church Street, would devote the second floor of the building to be used as a high school. This appears to have been Poughkeepsie's first high school to be used. For a few years during the Civil War, the school actually discontinued its use. So we're talking the 1860s here. The school actually closed down their high school because some of the students were going off to fight. As a matter of fact, one of the students from the school, John Maston, served in the Civil War and died in the Salisbury prison camp in North Carolina. So he had to have been, what, 16, 17 maybe? So that's that the school would eventually open back up. And then in 1871, construction had begun on the corner of Washington Street and Lafayette Place for the creation of the high school and city library. It was finished in 1872. Its very construction was initially voted down, but it passed on the second election. In 1877, the schools had their very first superintendent, Edward Burgess. I also wanted to add that this time the city library was sharing the space of the high school until it finally moved to where I am now in the 1890s. Later on, the Poughkeepsie City School District records, we see that by 1930, it was determined that each school should have its own library with its own collection of books. Now, the new high school, and by new, I mean quite old, really, but the new high school was built in 1914. Here we see the class of 1916 on the front steps. Eventually, the building would become Our Lady of Lourdes and is now the Family Partnership Center in Poughkeepsie. When it comes to the end game in education, there is no greater feeling than a college degree, right? No, I take that back. Actually, the greatest feeling is finding a job in the field that you like. That's the best feeling. You can have a fancy degree and no job. So, finding the job is the best feeling, but a college degree isn't too bad. So anywho, Poughkeepsie just happens to be the location of one of the nation's most famous colleges, Vassar, which of course was the idea of one of Poughkeepsie's most famous residents, this guy, Matthew Vassar. Now, Vassar was a self-made man. He was just overall a smart businessman. From his oyster bar in the basement of the Dutchess County Courthouse to his brewery on the waterfront, he also ventured into banking. He was one of the incorporators of the Poughkeepsie Savings Bank and the Farmers and Manufacturers National Bank. He served as the Poughkeepsie as a trustee and as president. He also served as president of the Hudson River Railroad. So all in all, he was a busy dude. Now, as we mentioned briefly earlier, Matthew's niece, Lydia Booth, had established Cottage Hill Seminary around 1835. The origins of Vassar College begin right about here. Benson Lossing, a well-known historian who we also talked about a little bit, said that Lydia had mentioned to her uncle several times that there was a need for higher education for women in this city, in this country overall. Vassar himself even mentioned in an autobiographical manuscript in 1866 that while speaking on occasional dealings with his niece, that's when he became inspired. And Miss Booth died in 1854, even before Vassar School was up and going. However, it was also the help of this guy right here, Dr. Milo P. Jewett, who had opened up several educational institutions both in the North and the South. Vassar would eventually become a reality thanks to this guy. So Vassar's first goal actually was a hospital. But Jewett was like, nah, dude, you only put those things up in grand cities. Poughkeepsie will never be that grand. No joke, that's what he said. Except for the nah, dude part. He didn't say that. But he did say that Poughkeepsie wasn't grand enough for a big hospital. So he said, build and endow a college for young women, which shall be to them what Yale and Harvard are to young men. That's an actual quote, by the way. Jewett would continue to bombard Vassar with all of his theories on why there should be a proper college for women, saying that the majority of teachers in this country were female. They were the ones instructing our children. So, of course, children are the future, blah, blah, blah. So, meanwhile, Vassar's two nephews, John and Matthew Jr., who he had taken under his wing, Matthew Vassar's brother had died, and so Vassar would take pretty much his two nephews under his wing, his brother's sons. So these two guys wanted their uncle to put the money into a hospital. They really wanted a hospital. They had no interest in a girls' college whatsoever. So they were kind of trying to get their uncle to not listen to this Jewett guy. And this was actually caused a lot of strain between Jewett and Vassar, which would eventually cost Jewett his position as president of the college. In 1860, Matthew Vassar bought land for his college, 200 acres, at the site of the former fairgrounds, 2 miles east of the city of Poughkeepsie. So he also wrote a letter to Susan B. Anthony, because apparently she wrote to him. And he said, quote, "Dear Madam, in reply to your note of yesterday, inquiring whether the report is true that I had made an appropriation of $400,000 to fund a college for girls in all respects equal to Harvard and Yale, I answer yes. And the grounds for this location purchased, the contract for the erection of the buildings awarded, and the work will be commenced early the ensuing spring. Yours respectfully, M. Vassar." Vassar ended up putting up well over $400,000 into his project. Groundbreaking for the school took place in 1861, just a few months after the start of the American Civil War. So naturally, it took a bit longer for construction for this thing. In September of 1865, Vassar Female College opened with 353 students, including a Civil War widow, between the ages of 15 and 24. The annual fee for tuition and residence was $350. The faculty numbered 30, 10 professors of whom were women, and 20 women as assistant teachers. John H. Raymond was president and professor of mental and moral philosophy, and Hannah W. Lyman was the principal. As time went on, more buildings were added to the property, more students would come, and eventually even men were allowed into Vassar, as you know. The first few guys were just after World War II, thanks to the GI Bill. And then finally, in 1969, the school adopted the co-education system that it still goes by today. And of course, you are all aware of the legacy of Vassar College and that it continues to thrive as one of the nation's leading liberal arts colleges. So we have taken a look at some of the old schools and seminaries of Poughkeepsie, and I hope that, that you can see why it was called the City of Schools. Now, before you say something like, hey, what about Arlington? Or wait a second, what about Our Lady of Lourdes? I didn't forget these things. Like I said earlier, I set guidelines for myself. I had to put up barriers. So I determined pretty early on in my work that if a school wasn't established before 1915, I wasn't going to talk about it. So Arlington, that was 1924. So too new. Lords, 1958. Too new. Marist College, 1929. Too new. St. Andrews on the Hudson. Now, that one, that was tough because that's 1903. But I consider St. Andrews to be High Park. So, no, not Poughkeepsie. No. Another old school that I was thinking of talking about, and it's worthy of mentioning, is the Oakwood Friends School because number one, it's super old school overall. It goes back to 1796, but it didn't start in Poughkeepsie. It started in Connecticut. It's a humble Quaker school, and its list of alumni is pretty impressive. You got Lucretia Mott, a Quaker suffragette and abolitionist. You got Lee Miller. She was a famous wartime photographer. You got Bonnie Raitt, right? Country star legacy, right? So these are all big names. However, it didn't start in Poughkeepsie. And it didn't get established in Poughkeepsie until 1920. So I had to cut it. But I had to limit myself somewhere because here we are. It's 8:19. I was supposed to end at 8. You guys know me. Blah, 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 blah. I talk forever. Anyway. So that is more or less our program. If you guys want to unmute yourselves and ask some questions, I'm going to go through the chat box and see what questions we got. So let's see. Most of these schools were for wealthy kids. Yes, most of these schools were for wealthy kids. That's an excellent assumption. It's true. Let's see. Were the women ever taught how to get jobs? Maybe women didn't work much in those days. Probably would be considered rebellious. Yep, that's true. Yeah, the job that was what women were most suited for was teacher. That was kind of it in the 19th century. That would change slowly, especially with Vassar College coming along, changing things up for women a little bit. Let's see. Women worked, they just didn't get paid for it. Amen. It's true. Let's see. Back then we're smaller, so the bed probably fit them. Yeah, that's true. It's certainly a bit smaller back then. Let's see. Where is Eastman buried? Eastman is buried in the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery, as a matter of fact. So he's there along with most of his family. Yes, apartments being built off of Mill Street. Yep, I'm excited to see what those are going to be like. I think all these schools were drawn to Poughkeepsie. That's a good question. Why were all these schools drawn to Poughkeepsie? I think a couple of things. Number one, it's in the beautiful Hudson Valley. It was a very attractive place to be. It was also becoming a very industrial city. So there were lots of jobs popping up in Poughkeepsie in the 19th century. So I think it was a very attractive place as far as employment, as far as the scenery. I think it was nice to be outside of New York City, something a little different, but with easy access to New York City via the trains or steamboats. So I think Poughkeepsie really had a lot going for it. And it still does, as a matter of fact. And I think that's why it still continues to attract Vassar students, Marist students, stuff like that. So that's a good question. Thank goodness for public free schools. Absolutely. 100%. We're very, very fortunate that we have the school system. Let's see. Very interesting. Thank you for presentation. Thank you. Now we know where many streets got their names from. Oh, yes. Yeah. Actually, my colleague Kira did a great program on street names of Poughkeepsie, and I think that might be on our YouTube page, as a matter of fact, if you're interested in checking that out. Any other questions? Okay. No questions? Is that it? Any other thoughts, comments, concerns, insults? No? Any Any books? What books? Books about what? Oh, on the topic. Yeah. There is. Oh goodness, there's one book that I turn to for a lot of information, and we have it here in our collection. Oh goodness, I think it's by a guy. I think his last name is King, and the book is. What is the title of the book? Hold on a second. I can find it. Where's our? Let's see. Where is? Hold on a second. Ha! I got it. History of Education in Dutchess County, 1716 to 1959, by Charles Donald King. So that is the book that I use for a lot of this information. Now I know how the fountain came to Poughkeepsie and its twins in the sun. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the great Soldiers Memorial Fountain. I love that fountain. I love walking past that all the time. Will you do that historic Poughkeepsie walk you had mentioned a while ago? Yes. So that's scheduled. It is on our calendar of events. Let's see. I'll go ahead and share the screen again. I'm gonna share my screen so you guys can see. So if you go to our website and you go to events and you go under calendar of events, let's see here. I think when did I schedule it for? Did I schedule it for October? I think I did. Hold on a second. October. Is it? I think I scheduled it for the 16th, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, walking tour of Academy Street Historic District. If you hit this green button that says register, you can sign up. Oh, there are 19 spaces available. I kind of made it limited because there's only so many people we can have on the side of the street and then be able to hear me talk about these things. So yeah, if you go ahead and register for the walking tour of Academy Street, it'll be Saturday, October 16th at 2 p.m. We will meet here in the Rotunda Gallery at Adrian's, and we will walk down the street and over to Academy and start our tour there. So that is coming up. You can sign up for that if you like. I think it'll be really, really good. I have to start working on that, actually. I've been so focused on this that I haven't yet started working on that. But don't worry, I'll have it all more or less put together. Okay, is that it? Is that all? Is it all we got? I think so. Okay, guys, thank you once again for attending another Local History Presents lecture. I hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you very much, and stay safe.